So last week I had a true-false problem up in the exercise where we looked at, is it true that I can just add the whole numbers, add the fractions? And we decided yes, that is true. Okay, then we, I hope, realized that when multiplying fractions, I can't just multiply the fractions, the whole numbers, and then multiply the fractions. That's not true. So today we're going to look more in depth at why that's not true. So the first thing we're going to go to is models for multiplication. All right, and let me just remind you, multiplication, of course, is commutative. So if we're looking at A times B, that's the same as B times A. But the meaning of this is literally, all right, so this means draw B A times. Now, I do still give full credit if you draw A B times, all right? But we are going to look at the difference between doing a problem this way. So, for example, if I have 5 times a third, all right, that means I have 5 of these things that I call thirds, right? So this is a thing that I call a third, right? If this whole rectangle is a whole. Another thing I have to remind you of is that it always depends on what's the whole in the problem. Okay, so this rectangle is the whole. So I have 5 of these things that I call wholes, or thirds, I mean. 5 of these things I call thirds. And that will result in then if I put these together, right? I can take all these pieces, put them together, and so there's my whole, and I would have the 3 here, and then the 2 here, and this is 1 2/3. Okay, so if I wanted to show a model for, say, 2/3 times 9, okay, if I were to draw 9 of something, okay, so if I drew a diagram like this, and this models 9, okay, which means that this is one whole. Okay, so again, I have to distinguish what's the whole in the problem. We learned last week how important that is. Now, if I want to talk about 2/3 of 9, right, I can divide this up into thirds, and here's 2 of them. Right, there's 2 of my thirds, and if each square is a whole, then I have 6 wholes. Okay, so my answer is 6. Now, if I want to show 3/2 of 6, okay, so draw 6 of something. Again, this is a whole. So if I want 3 of these things that I'm going to call halves, this would be a half. This would be a half. Okay, so 3/2 means I need 3 of these things that I just established that I called a half, right? I need 3 of them. Therefore, if this is my one whole, my answer is 9. Okay, so there's some multiplication of whole numbers by fractions. Now, if I want to multiply, let's look at a mixed number. 2.5 times 3 versus 3 times 2.5. Okay, so these will look different as far as the model, even though we know the final answer is going to be the same. Okay, so this first one's going to mean draw 3 2.5 times. Okay, so draw 3 2.5 times. So I'm going to call this 3. Okay, and I'm going to call this 3. All right, so that's represents 3. 2.5 times, well, if that's 3, what's this, right? Half of 3 would be 1.5. All right, so I can see that this is 7.5. Okay, versus over here, draw 2.5 3 times. Okay, so let's draw 2.5. So now I'm going to call this a whole. 2.5. I'm going to draw it 3 times. So notice my two models look very different, right, for the same problem. And whatever I put on a test or quiz or on the homework, I like you to try to follow the literal meaning of the product. But if you do it the other way around, I always give full credit. All right, and so again, I can see here these become a whole, and I can see here 7.5. All right, so next let's take a look at some models for, okay? Let's take a look at some models for multiplying two fractions, okay? 2/3 times 3/5. Okay. So this is going to be my whole. And remember, when we were multiplying whole numbers, like 3 times 2, right? Remember we did 3 in this direction, right? 2 in this direction, right? We use the array model for 3 times 2, okay? So same idea, except now I'm going to have 2/3 in one direction, 3/5 in the other direction. In this whole rectangle, this rectangle represents one whole. So in this direction, I'm going to show 3/5. All right, so I'm going to shade it. Okay, so there's my 3/5. On the other side of the rectangle, I want to show 2/3. All right, so I'm going to go this way. This is 2/3, right? I want 2/3 of just the 3/5. Okay, so I put an X here to show. Okay, and there's my 6, right? I get that by multiplying these, and my whole rectangle was split up into 15. So that's where I get my 6/15. All right, so let's do one more together, and then I'll have you pause the video and try one of these. Okay, so 1/2 of 2/5. So again, I'm going to divide into fifths this way, right? Here's my 2/5. Now in the other direction, I go 1/2. Right, so here's my 1/2 of the 2/5. Where do they overlap, right? And I can see that I have 2 out of 10. Okay, so please pause the video and try that one. Okay, so you should have taken your 1, divided it into 8. So let's see, I'm going to go into quarters first, and then 1/2 of a quarter is an 1/8. All right, here's 7 of these 8s. 7/8 go this way. Then I divide into 3 this way. So there's my 24 that I get when I multiply the denominators. And my 1/3 is just right here. So I want 1/3 of the 7/8. So at this point, you can complete your collected homework. Okay, but let's take a detailed look at multiplying a mixed number by a mixed number. Now, what you learn to do with basic skills is that anytime you had a mixed number, you made them improper, and then you followed the rule that we just talked about above. Okay, so we're going to take a closer look at why we can't just multiply the whole numbers, multiply the fractions. Okay, so let's look at it this way. Let's think about drawing 1 1/4. Let's draw 1 1/4 3 1/2 times. Okay, so I'm going to make 1 1/4. Here's 1. Right, so 1 1/4 is going to look like this. All right, I'm going to draw that 3 and then a half times, okay? So first I'm going to draw it 3 times, okay? And so come over here and I'm going to break this into 4 parts. All right, so first I'm going to draw each of these 3 times, okay? So for me to do that, I have to draw 3 times 1. That's going to be awfully easy. Okay, so here's my 3 times 1, which is just 3. Okay, so I established this shape as the whole. And then I have to do 3 times a quarter. So I'm going to do that over here. All right, so I want 3 of these things that I said is a quarter. All right, so I've established this as a quarter. All right, so there's 3 quarters. Right, here's my 3 holes. And now I have to do this. I've got it each 3 times. Now I have to do it a half a time. So I hope what you're noticing that I'm doing is I'm taking this, and when I multiply it by 3 and a half, I multiply each of these by 3. Then I have to multiply each of these by a half, and I hope you realize what I'm doing is just your FOIL that you learned back in 8th or 9th grade. Okay, so my first, well, let me finish the picture. So if I do a half times 1, okay, so here's my 1, and I want half of that. In other words, I want 2 quarters. Okay, so that's a half. And then I need a half of a quarter. So let's see, if I take my quarter diagram, but I want a half of a quarter, right? I hope I recognize that that is an 1/8, okay? But what I've really done is I have done FOIL, right? So this is my first outside, inside, last. I've got my 2 different representations, my concrete representation. Here's my more abstract representation down here, that I do this plus this. Right? So I do not advocate for teaching kids to do mixed numbers by FOIL. Okay? Don't advocate for that at all. I had to pick very carefully to get an example that would model nicely. In general, these problems don't model nicely. And so that's why, and here's what I want you to copy down then, what I wrote here in blue, that we must model. So the reason that we can't just multiply whole numbers, multiply fractions, is that we must multiply the entire quantity by the entire quantity. Okay? Most easily accomplished by making each fraction improper. Otherwise, I must FOIL. Okay, so I'll let you pause the video and write that down, but let me just say one more thing. People in our class aren't taking the final, but I always had a question on the final asking why we couldn't, why it's not allowed to just multiply the whole numbers, multiply the fractions, right? And I would say, why isn't that okay? And the reason it's not okay is you missed the outside, inside in your FOIL. This is just first and last. That doesn't work.